Based on interviews of dozens of Uber drivers in 2017, the Financial Times worked to develop a game that would inform users about the difficult situation these drivers face. The Uber game works as a choose-your-own-adventure game, with the goal to show you what it looks like to sit in the driver's seat of an Uber. You are asked questions like, will you choose to go home or sleep in your car? Fix the crack in the window or ignore it? Will you keep driving to earn more money or will you go home? The choice is yours. Games like these are not new, yet these games have a long way to go. As journalism adapts to a new digital age, video games are becoming a more attractive method of outreach. While there is a potential for such games, it is questionable that news games, like the Uber game, can be considered a valid genre within video games, and if so, can be misleading for users. To start off, I want to provide a clear definition of what is a news game. News games are a branch of serious games, or games that are built with purposes other than pure entertainment. While news games have been around since as early as 2001, the development of these games themselves is still far from becoming a mainstay of journalistic storytelling. The Financial Times' interest in games is part of a resurgence in the popularity and development of news games. This genre of games utilizes journalistic principles to inform users about topics related to the news by walking them through the context of complex situations or systems that are difficult to explain without experiencing firsthand. The Uber game begins with an opening scene that tells us that you have 2 kids to support and a $1,000 mortgage payment due in a week. You have to click yes to play. You have 2 options of gameplay, easier or harder. After playing both options, I can say it is difficult in both scenarios to achieve paying the bill. I consider this to almost be a hardwired outcome, as it further proves how difficult it is to be an Uber driver. While such an ending can be interpreted as a mechanism for understanding the situation Uber drivers are left in, as an avid gamer, this result can seem frustrating. While this is a common feature in video games, that attraction of losing but still wanting to play again to a point where it's almost addictive, this is not the case in the Uber game, mostly because the game is a choose-your-own-adventure style that offers little variety in your gameplay. You're presented with the same visuals, the same choices, and really the same outcome, which is losing, because that is what the developers intended for this game. Although facing defeat in the Uber game can elicit feelings of frustration as in most other games, the Uber game doesn't drive users to seek out that same experience of repeated playtime. This is a common dilemma of news games. While playing this game, you are bound to notice the colorful pop art design displayed throughout the game. While this art is meant to be simple and visually appealing to users, it doesn't convey the gravity of the issue at hand. Generally speaking, players, especially new, are drawn to games whose visuals and graphics appeal to their own interests. If a player is looking for a cozy or a fun game but is unaware of the news game genre, the Uber game immediately captures their attention. But alas, these colorful visuals are not a well-made representation of the intentions behind the Uber game. This is a misleading tactic that the developers could have made purposely with the intent of marketing the game to a wider audience. This continues to mislead gamers to engage in a game that fails to meet their expectations. If the Uber game was to solely convey the struggles of Uber drivers, it would be apparent that suitable visuals were to be less colorful and more gloomy or dreary. In other words, the visuals would convey the tonality of the issue rather than use a common marketing strategy to target more players. While this is a smart strategy, it's not that surprising coming from the Financial Times, but it does make me question the authenticity of news games as a genre of video games. And if you haven't noticed already, the Uber game doesn't have any sound. This is kind of surprising coming from a video game. Most video games use sound as an important factor into the experience of players. Music and sound can create tension and emotion that immerses users in the game. It would have been interesting to experience the Uber game with perhaps car sounds like the sounds of tires screeching or honking, and to really demonstrate the frustrations of Uber drivers, there could have even had been voiceovers, maybe audible sounds of long sighs or just a conversation between the driver and passenger. If a game lacks the component of music and sound, the game must rely heavily on everything else, including visuals and mechanics. And like I have pointed out before, the Uber game is already lacking in both of those departments. So really, this game is starting to look much more less like a video game. Personally, I expected music, and I struggled for maybe 5 minutes trying to see if my laptop was on mute or if I wasn't playing the game right. This made it really hard to begin playing the game, and could be another discouraging factor for users. Even if you ignore the lack of mechanics in this game and solely focus on the selection of choices to be made throughout the game, you begin to realize how choosing between these options are somewhat obvious and have predictable outcomes, such as in choosing between fixing your car window and not. If you don't fix the window, the likely outcome is having to deal with the consequences afterward, or even the choice between letting a passenger eat in the car. And if you do allow this, it damages your score and turns into a messy situation in the backseat of the car. So even the choices alone are not enough to entertain players and don't allow them to have control over how they will play this game. And if the Uber game has the intention of showing us the struggles of Uber drivers, perhaps they should not assume that these choices are always accessible. It could be the case that Uber drivers do not have the luxury to choose, whereas in this game, you are presented with a buffet of options. News games are not new. Given the current state of journalism and news corporations looking to make business profitable again, it isn't surprising that journalists are transitioning to online publications and video segments. The shift into a digital age is the primary reason journalists are looking for new ways to broadcast news, including through video games. Furthermore, games can effectively stimulate how things work by taking users and having them interact with certain situations. While games are not exactly new to journalism, for example, crosswords have always been a popular segment in newspapers, but these puzzles have little value and significance when it comes to the actual news part of journalism. That is why it's so interesting that journalism has turned to developing video games, in contrast to implementing simple crossword puzzles. Within newspapers, using video games as a direct outlet of news is simply not an effective way to do so. This is because video games have always been meant to be a form of entertainment and not a way to shed light on current events. This leads me to believe that this use of video games as journalism can be seen as manipulative, unethical, and rather harmful. While it is obvious that the amount of engagement in video games is significantly large and can be a great way to turn heads towards current events, it presses on a bigger issue of whether or not it is okay to mislead people to play a game with the intention of being entertained and instead ingrain dilemmas of political or social issues. While the Uber game makes it clear from the opening scene that this game is based on the experience of real Uber drivers, it still advertises itself as a video game. Many other news games do the same thing, yet they lack the specific elements of what it means to truly be a video game. This can be really confusing, especially to new players who are trying to experiment with video games. Now, because of these issues, I don't think it's fair to call news games a genre of video games. There is no doubt that news games have the potential into becoming real video games. But unless news games can collect larger resources to truly play as a video game, then perhaps then can news games be considered a genre within video games.